Okay, so following Extremis, I was in kind of a weird spot. Honestly, I'm really just kind of experimenting on you guys. I'm experimenting insofar that I am curious how you guys respond to covering older videos instead of all new, all different Marvel until like August or September or so, when like Marvel Legacy drops, versus how you guys respond to covering all new, all different Marvel stuff. I mean, there'll be a few things here and there that we cover, like Old Man Logan and Ultimates and stuff like that, but because it takes 6 months to finish a story, you know, I was like, well, we can kind of cover some older stuff in between. So I'm just kind of curious to how you guys respond to that whole thing. But as I was thinking about that, there were 2 different routes that we could have taken with Iron Man. We could have covered Iron Man Volume 4, or we could have covered Iron Man Volume 5. 4 is longer than 5. And 5, of course, you know, being newer is more modern and really kind of ties into a lot of what people are talking about in terms of what's going on with Iron Man right now. And so I figured we kind of do 5 since we could probably get about 6 or 7 videos out of it and then call it a day. And that'll really give me a good litmus test on how you guys respond to things. So if by the time this is all said and done, you guys make it clear that you just don't care about older stuff and you want all new, all different Marvel, then we'll switch back to that. We may be able to find a happy balance with both. But with regards to this one of the other reasons that I chose that is because with Extremis fresh on our minds, this one deals directly with the fallout of that. But there are a couple things to run over, specifically with Volume 4. Nothing super complicated, nothing really difficult or convoluted. With the character of Maya Hansen, for example, she was basically arrested at the end of the Extremis storyline in Volume 4, released on parole, and then she went to go work for S.H.I.E.L.D. and Tony Stark, because at the time, Tony Stark was director of S.H.I.E.L.D. following the events of Civil War. And so because of that, it was really just kind of her proving the fact that she was more or less reformed. The whole idea with Extremis was just kind of part of her past, and she was ready to let that go. And that was really it. I mean, it was just kind of a way to, you know, build her character a bit. The other half of this is that in the post-Civil War landscape, Iron Man Volume 4 stretched through a lot of things and went all the way up to like Siege and so on and so forth. What ended up happening is going into Siege, and really even after the events of Civil War, when Tony Stark's moral compass was called into question, the idea that maybe he'd been fighting on the wrong side for all the wrong reasons, he more or less kind of suffered this crisis of conscience. And so after being ousted as director of S.H.I.E.L.D., he basically formed a company called Stark Resilient, which basically served the purpose of being like a more economic friendly arm, where Stark International was more of like a weapons manufacturing arm of Stark. Resilient was going to focus more on the everyday things, so just improving technology overall for the betterment of society itself. The issue with this is that it made him a target for a multitude of different people, injure those that he cared about, Pepper Potts and so on and so forth. And so Tony Stark actually left Resilient and made Pepper Potts the CEO. So those are guys who were reading like Superior Iron Man, that's where that came from. Volume 4 has some cool things here and there, but I think that Volume 5 is more pertinent to just cool Iron Man stuff. Now, this particular story arc is called Believe, and what this does is deal with the fallout of Extremis, and it tells us that Extremis did not go away, that Extremis is very much there. Now, what we do here is we actually pick up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, with Maya Hansen. Now, the crazy thing about this is that she's being pursued by AIM, Advanced Idea Mechanics. Now, here's the thing. Advanced Idea Mechanics originally started out as like the science/technology arm of Hydra with the goal of world domination. Eventually, AIM broke away from Hydra following the death of Baron von Strucker and became their own organization, but they still had the same goal of like dominating the world. But for example, Advanced Idea Mechanics were the first ones to create a cosmic cube. And so again, they have all kinds of different, studies and so on, but Extremis is just another instance of them trying to launch a plot that will see them, trying to secure world domination. And so the result of this is that Maya Hansen in her panic sends out an automated message, Tony Stark gets it, and basically it's her saying, look, this is an automated message informing you that if you get this, I'm likely dead, and Extremis is on the loose again. Now, this is kind of cool because the first place we go to is basically one group that's managed to take hold of Extremis, and this is basically just an organization that's more or less Advanced Idea Mechanics themselves. Now, of course, the cool thing about this is that a lot of what we end up seeing here, in this conflict between Tony Stark, the fact that he basically has armor that's in a liquid state, this all really kind of lays the groundwork for like Indesim armor, for example, that he has in Superior Iron Man, different things like that. And that's why I said Volume 5 is a little more pertinent in terms of Iron Man and as far as you guys think of him, because of the fact that there's so many interesting things in here that lay the groundwork for what comes later. Of course, really all that stuff, Indesim, the whole 9 yards, that whole predecessor was Extremis. The fact remains here that Tony Stark basically locating, finding AIM, getting a hold of their head guys was really quick and it was really simple. I mean, AIM was purporting that Extremis would be like the next stage in technology or something along those lines, and the idea was to basically use it for their own ends. Now, of course, the question that Tony Stark has is, where is the rest of Extremis? What's going on here? Now, eventually he manages to find himself mixed up with some of the guys of Advanced Idea Mechanics who have reached beyond and actually have a place called New Avalon. Now, Tony Stark himself as Iron Man has intrigued quite a few people people. In this particular instance, it's really more of like a battle. It's more of like a conflict. What these guys have done is they have taken Extremis, they've made it into actual armors, and then brought in basically people who specialize in a multitude of different things, whether it's hand-to-hand combat, being a pilot, whatever the case may be. And the idea here is to run a gauntlet. Can they be as good as Tony Stark? Because keep in mind, in the realm of Marvel Comics, when it comes to like mechanized suits or technology or something like that, Tony Stark is the #1 guy in terms of weaponizing technology. Now, in terms of overall intelligence, it's kind of a toss-up. I mean, in All New, All Different Marvel, they established that Moon Girl's like the smartest girl on the planet. But prior to that, it was like Reed Richards, Valeria Richards, and Dr. Doom who held the #1 spot. And now who it was actually #1 would change based on the story, but those three were generally the smartest people on the planet. In terms of weaponizing technology, Tony Stark is the #1 guy, and the Iron Man suit is the title to beat. If these guys, these pilots in these Extremis suits can beat Iron Man, then it means that this weapon is a success, that, you know, Extremis, as it's been used by this organization, will effectively work. They can in turn build more suits, hand those over, and gain new contracts with the US government to really replace what it is that Tony Stark does. Now, the cool thing about all this is that it basically creates a scenario whereby Iron Man himself is basically able to function at peak capacity. And what I mean by this is Tony Stark's armors are usually modular whenever it comes to the different equipment and stuff that he uses. And what that means is that different aspects of the suit can be detached and something else can be put in its place. And that's really the nature of it here. It's an invitation to use all the tools at his disposal and see if he can face off against each one of these individual guys. And for the most part, he's successful. He manages to stave off the attacks of almost every single one of these guys. The goal is that if he wins, he ultimately gets to take the Extremis with him. And so the cool thing about this is that some of these guys specialize in hand-to-hand combat, and the suits reflect that accordingly, in the sense that they're really more kind of in Tony Stark's face, punching, kicking, so on and so forth. Others are better at flight, at diverting attacks, playing more defensively. And so it's really kind of cool to see how these armors relate to what it is that Iron Man has. But at the end of the day, they are not Tony Stark. They do not have the ability to capitalize on their own skills in the same capacity that Tony Stark has the ability to capitalize on his. And so, of course, fighting these guys really serves as a distraction. And what he basically does is just kind of snatch up the Extremis kit and then just take off. I mean, really the most dishonorable way to end the conflict is just kind of grab the thing and then just bolt. And that's really it. I mean, it's kind of it's kind of a crappy thing to do. But what this is designed to do is basically give us a tour of how Extremis can be used in different ways. This next guy actually uses it for medical purposes, and it's really kind of cool. Again, because of the fact that Maya had sent Tony Stark a notification saying, hey, look, here are the versions of Extremis that have managed to get out. Here are their, unique identity signatures. It's basically just tracking down these different locations, traveling to those locations, and facing off against people. The other half of this is we actually get to see a little bit of expansion on the various suits that Tony Stark uses. For example, one of these suits is one where he basically has the ability of camouflage, where he can bend light around himself. Now, if you're interested in the different suits that Tony Stark uses, I have like 4 or 5 videos that I did where we basically run over each one of his suits and what it is that they're capable of doing. Again, this one in particular is one that we had referenced previously, where he's able to basically bend light around himself to either make him invisible or to camouflage himself and create holograms. But once he ends up getting into this particular building where this Extremis kit is being located at, and he gets down to the basement, he actually finds a girl in bed, but then also comes across some members of his rogues gallery. Now, this is also kind of cool because it shows us some of the other ways that Extremis can be used, not in the sense of creating suits of armor, but in the sense of enhancing people's already existing abilities. The Living Laser, Firebrand, Vibro. These are guys that have their own intrinsic capabilities and powers. For example, Firebrand manipulates fire. Under normal circumstances, she's no real threat to Tony Stark, but with Extremis enhancements, her powers are pushed that much further. Not only that, because it's designed to enhance the human body, her physical agility, her strength, so on and so forth, all these things are increased. Now again, Tony Stark is coming out of all of this having dealt with Extremis before, and so it's not like he's taken by surprise the same way he was with Malin. Instead, all of his suits were upgraded to be able to withstand virtually any scenario when it comes to the Extremis tech. He'll sit down and he'll encounter a situation that he's never met before. He'll overcome his situation, and then he'll sit down and say, okay, under what circumstances could I encounter this scenario again? What million ways could this scenario play out? And then every last one of his suits will be upgraded to meet that particular scenario. In this instance, because of the fact that this is Rogues Gallery, he's fought all these different guys time and time again. His suits are already equipped for the most part to be able to handle that. In truth, these guys are taken out pretty easily. I mean, they're defeated pretty readily. But of course, with a living laser having charged through a wall, what this does is it tells Tony Stark that he probably charged through multiple walls, meaning that just following the holes in the wall is basically what it is. But the fact remains that once he gets inside this room, this is an instance where not everybody who captures Extremis uses it for nefarious ends. And this particular guy has a daughter that's basically dying of cancer. And the idea was to use Extremis for the purpose of trying to find a way to cure her. The issue here is that this guy does not know the ins and outs of Extremis. He's smart, but he doesn't quite know how to use it or how to modify it in a way that will benefit his daughter. And so what he did is he actually kidnapped several people or used several people and injected them with Extremis, hoping that he'd be able to find a way to basically cure his daughter. The issue is that, for the first person, it didn't matter. They effectively ended up dying. For the second person, they were cured, but his daughter is extremely sick in the same capacity as the first person. And so really, what seems to be the case is that there's no way for his daughter to be rescued. In comes Tony Stark with an inoculation that's basically going to cure this guy's daughter. But the problem with this is that this guy broke the law. Despite his desperation, despite the fact that he wanted to keep his daughter safe, at the end of the day, he still broke the law. And so the result of this is that he's basically going to be arrested and taken to jail, but his daughter's gonna live. So again, it's kind of a cool scenario to see how Tony Stark deals with these different versions of the Extremis virus. Now from here, we switch over to the catacombs in Paris. If you guys ever get a chance, you should definitely look it up. There are people who will party. They'll go and they'll have parties and stuff like that, and they'll go into the catacombs, especially if they're not from France, they'll get lost and they'll die. They'll starve to death because it is a labyrinth down there. It's absolutely insane. With regards to this whole thing in Paris, Tony Stark, of course, realizes that one of the signals is coming from the catacombs. Now, the catacombs themselves are a small, tight space, which means there's no real room for maneuverability, and so Tony Stark plans accordingly and basically adopts one of the newest versions of the Hulkbuster armor. Now, this is a Hulkbuster slash a general tank all-purpose suit in the sense that it's not designed explicitly for the Hulk, but it certainly can help. So once he gets down there, what he finds is a veritable bloodbath. I mean, it's absolutely insane. There's just body parts, just pieces of scientists all over the place. Well, of course, this leads him to coming across something like 12 or 13 women who have these different etchings carved on their faces. Now, this is when things get kind of weird, and in truth, it's played pretty fast and loose. The idea from one of the scientists seems to be that they were trying to resurrect the Great Black Infinite. We're not told what that is. Honestly, it doesn't matter. It's really just kind of Kieron Gillen saying these are crazy religious fanatics, and as a result, they ended up just creating monsters with no understanding of what it was that they were doing. But this tells us that basically when Maya Hansen was forced to recreate it by AIM and it was sold by AIM, it was, hey man, whoever wants to buy it can have it. We don't care what you do with it. And so again, it's really kind of wild here just because of the fact that one of the scientists that's left tries to take out Tony Stark. Of course, he fails, but in doing so, where this scientist had all these different, etchings and stuff around the door in order to keep himself protected, with the door destroyed, the protection's no longer there. And this guy is basically just kind of torn to pieces. Now, this is when we get into one of the darker sides of Tony Stark. And the reason why is because of the fact that, of course, he has his new AI essentially replicate the symbols that were previously on the door to create a kind of, protective aura around himself, after which, all these different young women just kind of enter a pacified state. But because of the fact that Extremis, if allowed to manifest for too long, basically corrupts and destroys the minds of the people who have ingested it, what it basically means is that there's no saving these girls. They're too far gone. In truth, all Tony Stark can really do is just issue a mercy killing. And that's exactly what he does. He basically just begins using a high intensity laser to incinerate these girls' heads. Now, this is dark, but it's also as humane as Tony Stark can possibly be. They don't feel a thing. I mean, one minute there's a bright light, the next, that's it. That's all she wrote. And so it takes 20 seconds for it to charge, which means that if he's issuing out 11 or 12 shots, he's got to wait a little over 2 minutes in order to basically take out all these different folks. And so because of that, it's pretty intense and it takes a toll, because for him, he's basically killing people. And if at all possible, Tony Stark always tries to keep people alive unless there's absolutely no choice. And in this instance, there was really no choice. And so what ends up happening is this last little Extremis kid actually takes us into space. And it's really kind of cool the way that this happens, just because of the fact that one of the people, or at least really one of the guys, that has taken this is a guy named Eli. Now, of course, Eli and Tony Stark go back quite a bit in the sense that they've been both, comrades, and they've, been soldiers at arms, so to speak, on the front line of the technological arms race and different things like that. But Eli is actually using Extremis for a pretty interesting concept. Historically speaking, Extremis has always been weaponized. Ever since the virus was created and released, people have always weaponized it. Now, I mean, in this instance, we see people who are trying to use it for medical means, but 9 times out of 10, it's being used in some form of weaponry. What this guy, Eli, wants to do is actually use it for the purpose of exploration. In his mind, humanity's limited on the planet Earth. We talked about this when Iron Man joined the Guardians of the Galaxy, and actually the way this story ends will go directly into Guardians of the Galaxy, so I might put it in that playlist just for the sake of it. But the fact remains here that with regards to humanity on Earth, humanity is very primitive, relatively speaking. speaking to like all the other species. I mean, you got to think the Kree Empire stretches systems, solar systems. The Skrull Empire is the exact same way. The Shi'ar Empire is an amalgamation of different races. And here you have humanity stuck on a singular planet. This guy using Extremis is to basically say, why be limited by such a basic thing? Why would you want to weaponize Extremis? I mean, use it for exploration. And so the goal is to reprogram Extremis so that it can be modified in the human genome to allow people to walk on Mars without suits and basically begin the process of colonizing other planets, looking to the future. Now, under normal circumstances, Tony Stark would agree with this. And in fact, he says that. He says, look, I would agree with you. I'd be behind you 100% of the way under any normal circumstance. If this was sanctioned by the federal government, if like Reed Richards had a hand in it or something like that. But if I can come in here, then that means Doctor Doom can come in here. It means that like Magneto could come in here. It means any number of villains could just walk in and take it. And then suddenly they've just got a ridiculous amount of power. What this does is it leads to the most logical outcome, a conflict between Tony Stark and, Eli and his various forces. Now, of course, again, this is Tony Stark playing it smart. It's him sitting down and saying, look, we're in a space station out in the middle of nowhere. They're not going to shoot bullets just because of the fact that if they did, all it would take is a pinprick of a hole in a wall, and then suddenly it's just explosive decompression. Oxygen just goes violently escaping out of the hole. Next thing you know, the whole space station blows up and it takes all of us with them. And so in his mind, he knew that they were simply going to go for incapacitating him. Well, because of the fact that he's wearing a mechanized suit, they would use electronics. And so as a result, he basically reconfigures his suit to cope with any kind of electromagnetic interference, which allows him to maintain the suit's functionality and then in turn take all these different guys out, after which he grabs the Extremis kit and takes off. And so what ends up happening here is Tony Stark goes back and has a conversation with Pepper Potts. And it's really kind of cool to see this because he says, look, after Civil War, after Secret Invasion, after being director of S.H.I.E.L.D., being forced out of S.H.I.E.L.D., after starting Resilient and then having to leave Resilient, after faking my death, after all these things that have happened, I'm ready to take a break. Like, I'm ready to clear my head. I'm tired of being on Earth. I'm ready to go out. I'm ready to do something else. I'm ready to go experience something else, do any number of things. And so what he does is he basically dons a suit specialized for interstellar travel, for traveling the spaceways. And he essentially just leaves the planet Earth. He basically just takes off. And as a result, this is when he joins the Guardians of the Galaxy. Okay, so continuing our trend covering some older Iron Man stuff, we actually pick up with a story called The Secret Origin of Tony Stark. Now, technically speaking, this was something like 12 issues long, and it's actually split into like 3 or 4 different storylines. In the first part, it's like 3 issues and then 3 issues, and those are 2 story arcs. And then in the second part, it's like 4 issues and 2 issues, and those are 2 story arcs. But we're not going to worry about all that. We're just going to kind of finish the first 2 and then go to the second 2 and then call it a day. So it'll make sense as we go through it. And in fact, you really won't even notice transition from one storyline to another. But the cool thing about this one is that, remember, this is when Tony Stark had basically taken off from Earth and joined the Guardians of the Galaxy for a time. And then he actually ended up defecting from the Guardians of the Galaxy. And so what this does is this actually picks up in the aftermath of the Avengers versus X-Men storyline. Now, basically that story just dealt with the idea of the return of the Phoenix Force. Now, that whole Avengers versus X-Men storyline branched out into a litany of different things. The fact remains that with Tony Stark, after the events of Avengers versus X-Men, he had basically just kind of bailed out. And so what this does is show us that there are galaxy sweeping ramifications for the things that go on with regards to planet Earth and the things that various heroes do. And so of course, with Tony Stark kind of, being really chatty, talking up a woman from a different world, what's kind of cool about this is that this is a group called the Valdi, and they are really kind of like the harbingers of a lot of different races that have existed over the years in Marvel Comics. And in fact, that's really kind of what Kieron Gillen's throwing in here. It's a little bit of a retcon. In terms of the different races in Marvel, whether it's like the Shi'ar or the Kree or the Skrull, whatever the case they may be, we always kind of assumed they just evolved in their own section of the universe. And in a lot of ways they did. But what this story about the Valdi does is it tells us that somewhere along the line, they came into contact with the Shi'ar, which is why the Shi'ar look like the Valdi. They dress like the Valdi, the fashion aspect imprinted on them. There were other elements of their own society that imprinted on the Kree and on the Skrulls and so on and so forth. And so it's one of these things where, well, I wouldn't say the Valdi were like progenitors for all beings in existence. Their role within the universe certainly helped to influence other races around the universe in terms of their evolution and how they progress. The funny thing about this is that this chick's like one of those crazy religious girls, but for Tony, it's really just kind of like one of those one-offs, where like you get with her, then you bail, and you never have to deal with her craziness. The problem with this is that when she sees what he looks like under his mask, she freaks out and she just starts reading him the riot act. She's just like, "You're hideous under your mask." Which really kind of sucks. It really kind of blows because he was expecting, to have a happy ending to the night, which he doesn't really get. But ultimately, he's basically attacked by the Valdi directly, at least by some of their cops, and brought before their high priestess. And what we end up finding out is that the Valdi, like so many other races across the Marvel universe, especially the Shi'ar, basically worshipped the Phoenix Force. And so the idea here is that because Tony Stark and the Earth-based superheroes effectively destroyed the Phoenix Force, he is going to be held accountable for that crime in particular. Now, what this does is this actually brings in a character called Recorder 451. Now, the Recorders are created by a race called the Rigelians, and in fact, they actually date all the way back to 1966 with Thor number 129, which is when they were first introduced. And what's funny about that, because we're really just kind of coming out of it, their introduction actually centers around Ego the Living Planet, which is really kind of interesting. It's really kind of funny how it all ties together. But back when Ego first popped up in Marvel Comics, he was just like a sentient planet that just existed in this place called the Black Galaxy. And they called it that way because everything that came into contact or came into that galaxy was basically absorbed and ingested by Ego the Living Planet to both provide him with the energy he needs, as well as absorb their knowledge and expand his own intelligence. Now, of course, this eventually dead-ended into a story where Thor and Galactus fought Ego, and then Galactus just like strapped a rocket to his back end and sent him just hurling across the universe. It was weird, but the fact remains that the Rigelians were really more of like explorers and colonizers. And so the idea was that if the Black Galaxy is there and Ego the Living Planet threatens their existence, their goal was to essentially go out and explore the rest of the cosmos in order to find other worlds to settle on. And to do this, they created Recorders. And the Recorders are basically these robots that would just go out, they're more or less probes. They would go out, they would explore some predetermined destination in space, they would report back, their memories would be wiped, and they would repeat the process. That's all that they would do. Well, this particular guy, 451, for reasons that are not initially given to us, and in fact, reasons I don't even think are given to us at all, for whatever reason, he didn't go back, and instead, he just kept exploring the cosmos. And so he's been around for millennia and basically just seen everything there is to see. And so we're actually going to find out that he plays a major role in the whole secret origin of Tony Stark. But 451 just kind of showing up and talking to Tony Stark is done for the purpose of actually breaking him out of jail, or at least trying to find a way to get him out of there. And so what happens is once he's brought before this tribunal, more or less, he basically demands trial by combat. And in doing so, he's paired up against, a handful of different people. Now, all the different trials he goes through, all the different battles he goes through are done for the charges he's facing. And he's facing dozens and dozens of charges, destroying a deity, heresy against the Valdi, and, just being a dick. I mean, there's all different kinds of charges that he's facing here. And so because of that, he actually ends up going against a multitude of different foes and beating every last one of them. Now, the reason why is because of the fact that while Tony Stark himself has no real combat abilities, the Valdi race as a whole doesn't fight. They're not a conflicting society. They're very much like Norrin Radd's race before he became the Silver Surfer. Those individuals who basically sought out to just kind of engage in peace and study, really more of like arts and so on and so forth, as opposed to conflict. They're just a bunch of hippies. So because of that, Tony Stark's able to take out almost every last one of these guys just because of the fact that in his own escapades as an Avenger, he's able to hold his own. But because of the fact that he's able to defeat all of these guys, what ends up happening is the Valdi call in someone called Death's Head. Now, Death's Head was created by a guy named Simon Furman, and this is actually a really cool story. Simon Furman was working for Marvel's UK imprint back in the 1960s or 70s, and that was basically Marvel's attempt to branch out into the United Kingdom, into England, and create stories that people would care about. That's where like Captain Britain came from, and the Excalibur team, and all that kind of good stuff. But the fact remains here that Death's Head was created as a Transformers character, and Simon Furman actually threw him in the Transformers comics. The problem was that at the time, comic books were becoming more and more popular, and the Transformers were growing into their own by quite a huge margin. I mean, it was like issue number 100 and something by the time the 1960s rolled around. And so because of that, the fear was that if Death's Head stayed in the Transformers comics exclusively, then he would basically become a Transformers property. And so because of that, Marvel would essentially lose the rights to him, because back then it was kind of like creator-owned content. So if a guy made something and threw it into a comic, so long as it stays in that line of comics, it becomes the property of that line of comics. And so what Marvel did is they actually cranked out this super quick like one-shot that basically had Death's Head inside a Marvel comic, which in turn meant Marvel could say, now he's the exclusive property of us. They in turn filed a copyright claim on Death's Head and then made Death's Head a Marvel character. And so it was really kind of cool the way they pulled that off. It was like She-Hulk, right? Like they wanted to do She-Hulk in the TV show, so Marvel cranked out a comic to make She-Hulk a Marvel character, and so then they had to go and just get permission from Marvel in order to include her in, and Marvel got all the money from the She-Hulk appearances that ever showed up outside of the comic books. But the fact remains that Death's Head is basically just a giant robot, and he's really a bounty hunter, but standing some 30 feet feet tall, he's a lot more powerful than Tony Stark is. So again, it's actually kind of crazy. Now, something else to point out here is that Tony Stark is forced to fight without his armor. And even those individuals that he's going against are forced to fight without weapons. So it's actually kind of a cool little tidbit here. But the fact remains that with him more or less being saved, this comes by way of his new AI called Pepper, which is basically just a way to maintain his connection to Pepper Potts when he's out in space. It's a totally it's an autonomous AI. It's not really Pepper Potts, it's just kind of modeled after her. But the way the Recorder 451 breaks Tony Stark out is by capturing something called the heart of the Valdi. And basically, this is a massive energy source the Valdi use to keep their society going and to keep their energies going, and does so by basically feeding on the excess energy of the Celestials and various other cosmic entities in the Marvel Universe. Well, the Celestials are none too happy about that, and apparently they've been searching around for the Valdi forever. With the heart of the Valdi, they were able to keep themselves basically hidden and protected. With the heart of the Valdi gone, the Celestials obliterate the entire place. They just kind of show up out of nowhere and destroy everything. So it's actually pretty wild and it's pretty messed up. But ultimately, Tony Stark just kind of has to leave, just kind of has to let him go and fly off. And so what this does is it leads to him coming into direct contact with Death's Head himself. Now, of course, Death's Head had basically just kind of bailed out when everything was going to pot, when it all was kind of going to pieces. But Recorder 451 basically kind of took off and then kind of poked fun at Tony Stark a little bit, like, hey, catch me if you can, that kind of a thing. Well, the universe is a massive place. And so because of that, Tony Stark allying himself alongside Death's Head would give him resources to like the kind of things that bounty hunters only have. And he's eventually able to track down Recorder 451. What we end up finding out here, though, is that Recorder 451 basically set all this up. 451 essentially, as soon as Tony Stark and Death's Head show up, Recorder 451 hacks into Tony Stark's suit, takes control of his AI, and then it also turns out that he had basically paid Death's Head to lead Tony Stark here in the first place. And so the reason why is because of the fact that Recorder had to create a circumstance where Tony Stark would come to him. And the reason for that is because Recorder 451 has a very important piece of information. This piece of information being a message directly from Tony Stark's father. And so the crazy thing about this is that Tony Stark's just kind of made to watch just because of the fact that Recorder has control of his armor and that kind of thing, and Stark really can't leave. But initially, we're not told exactly what it is that his father said. Instead, we're just kind of like given this jump over where it's just like, okay, and that's what he said. And then of course, Tony Stark's kind of reacting to it and freaking out. But what we end up finding out here is that the parents of Tony Stark had a very hard time conceiving. Howard and Maria just could not conceive a child. And so much like Doctor Strange trying to find a way to heal his hands, Howard ends up traveling around to various people. And this is kind of cool because it's a lot of the most intelligent scientific people in the realm of Marvel Comics, but they deal mostly with biology more so than anything else. The Eternal City, where all the Eternals live, these basically angelic-like beings in the Marvel Universe don't really have a way to save him. The High Evolutionary, a guy that basically deals with growing human beings, cannot do anything to help him. Now, the fact remains that we actually end up picking up with Howard Stark kind of falling to the bottom of the barrel, where a guy's like, hey man, I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy, and this leads him to Las Vegas, Nevada, where he comes into contact with this guy who's basically a gray. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is the first appearance of their race inside Marvel Comics, and they're not significant here, but the Greys actually operate out of a casino called Area 52, Area 52 in Las Vegas. Now, the funny thing about this is that it's like that rule, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And if you've ever been to Las Vegas before, there's crazy people everywhere. And so like someone walking around as an alien, no one's gonna bat an eye. They just kind of blend in perfectly. What the Gray basically says is that there is a robot, of course we know that now to be Recorder 451, stuck inside this particular casino thing that looks like a UFO. And the idea is to basically break in and steal this recorder. Now, of course, the cool thing about this is that the recorder is not established to be the guaranteed way for Howard and Maria Stark to have a kid. Instead, what happens is the Gray says, hey, look, this robot supposedly has like traveled around the universe and seen everything. And so if there is a way for you to achieve whatever goal it is that you want to achieve, because, Howard doesn't tell the Grays that he wants to have a kid or anything, he basically says, look, this recorder would be the way for you to be able to pull it off. And so ultimately what ends up happening is Howard Stark assembles his own team. It's kind of cool because it's like this 1960s kind of situation with all these different things unfolding. Now, keep in mind, because of the fact that this is the 1960s, the Marvel Universe is still relatively new at this point. I mean, in terms of superhero immersion. So like mutants are just just now showing up. So things are still relatively new in terms of how it's all unfolding. But this is kind of fun because it turns into this sort of like heist mission, right? It's kind of like Ocean's 11 meets Marvel Comics, which I love Ocean's 11. And so I love this kind of scenario. This guy, the Gray, goes in and distracts the various members of his race who are here and are running this casino, and essentially says, hey, look, this guy stole our robot, and he took off over to this one location, and so we have to go find him. Now, what had happened here is one of the guys of Tony Stark's team used an image inducer and basically made Recorder 451 invisible, as well as him and Howard Stark. And so what this meant was that when the Greys showed up inside the room where the robot was supposed to be, to their eyes, it was invisible and it was gone. And so again, this is cool because it shows us that like some of the thievery and stuff and like some of the schemes are like pretty cool in terms of the kind of stuff that they were pulling off. And so ultimately they break it out, and we actually end up finding out that like Maria Stark, Howard Stark's wife, is basically like part of the whole thieves game. Like she's very much involved in this whole Black Ops-esque, scenario. She's a pilot and all that stuff. And so it's really kind of cool. But again, we're only given one half of this story. And the reason is because after Tony Stark is given all this information, the Recorder says there's a lot of other things that we did, a lot of other things that we ended up getting involved in. And where Tony Stark initially asks, okay, what happened next? What's the next stage? How does all this lead into presumably the birth of me? The Recorder's also a little kind of cloak and dagger here, where he basically says, yeah, this all does kind of lead into you, but we have a destination that you're going to. And so for right now, you got to go to sleep, man. So he basically knocks him out, and they end up taking off to their destination, which of course turns out to be the final battleground of the war between the Celestials and the Aspirants. And this is actually really, 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 really cool. It's one of the coolest elements with regards to this whole thing. Of course, we'll find out more about that in the next video. In the meantime, what we actually end up doing is jumping back to Howard and Maria Stark, and we get the last little tidbit of this story, at least in terms of what led into Tony Stark. And what we end up finding out here is that with them basically kind of rescuing the Recorder, the answer he gives is, yes, I will definitely help you guys create a child. Now, the cool thing about this is that the Recorder's not doing it for altruistic reasons. There's actually a motivation behind it, and it stems directly from the nature of the planet Earth. The Recorder, having traveled around, the cosmos for so long and having seen so many different things, recognizes the placement of Earth. And that's really the kind of case when it comes to Marvel Comics. For whatever reason, the Earth is just strategically placed in like the best possible position when it comes to wars and conflicts. And so the Recorder being here is done for the purpose of not creating a superpowered being, but creating a person that can basically have the intelligence to make the Earth a futurist place, to look to the horizon and find ways to basically speed up the Earth's development in terms of weapons, technology, defense systems, laying the stage for everything that would make Tony Stark who he is. And so because of this, what Recorder basically says is, I'm going to essentially give you a child and then modify it on the genetic level to be predisposed to a higher level of intelligence. Now, for any parent who's being told, we are going to make modifications to your child before it's born, that is a terrifying concept. Regardless of whether or not it's going to benefit your child or it's going to cause harm to your child, it's a terrifying idea. And so because of that, to have genetic modifications to their kid really just kind of freaks them out, and it really kind of bothers them a little bit, but ultimately they end up going through with it. Now, what we're going to find out is there's a little more that was going on behind the scenes, and the way that Kieron Gillen does it is absolutely genius. But the fact remains here that we end up having Maria Stark going through the insemination process when the child is basically bestowed inside of her, and 6 months later, she gives birth to a kid herself. Now, this kind of wraps up by the fact that the Greys eventually catch up to the Starks themselves, and the reason why this is so important is because the Recorder sits down and says, no one can know that this baby is here. No one can know that this child has basically been modified by me. Anybody who knows about it is going to have to be killed. As far as they're concerned, they need to believe that you have a happy and healthy, normal baby. And so if the Greys have stumbled across this, and if the Greys have realized that I, as a Recorder, am involved in the birth of your child, then they're going to put two and two together. And even if they don't come to the absolute truth, they're going to become information brokers. They're going to say a Recorder from a super advanced race is on Earth and helping a human couple give birth to a child. It probably did something to that kid that made it super advanced. And so again, it's actually going to speed up the timeline of the various races that would see the Earth as a threat and try to destroy it. And so in response, Howard Stark and this Recorder travel to this location of where the Greys are at and essentially kill them all. Now, Tony Stark's reaction to this, it's a lot of doubt. And so because of that, it's kind of a funny situation, because in this whole scenario, the Recorder basically says, hey, look at where you are right now. You're literally an engineer down to the genetic level. You were designed to just be that smart. And so again, it's really kind of cool to see a lot of this changing going on with regards to his character, a lot of this expansion being added here. And so ultimately, once we get to the question of, well, what happened next after the whole scenario with the Greys, Kieron Gillen ends the story. So we will find out in the next video what it is that goes on further with the whole idea of Tony Stark, because where this seems to be pretty self-explanatory and pretty interesting on the surface, when we get in depth, it's gonna get a lot more interesting, because I will say this, nothing here is as it appears to be. Okay, so picking up with the second part of the secret origin of Tony Stark, really Stark's origin, the Recorder and what's really going on with the motivations of Recorder 451. And what we end up finding out here is that following the birth of Tony Stark, they effectively call it a day. Like the Recorder's just kind of like, okay, he takes off and that's really it. I mean, because his job's done. And it's really kind of cool here, because with everything that's happened, the question of Howard and Maria Stark is, what do we do now? It's really kind of cool, because I feel like that's the question that almost every parent asks, you know, and I think that's one of the things that makes, you know, parenting pretty exciting. But the whole idea here, at least from what Recorder 451 tells Tony Stark, is that he was engineered for a particular purpose, and the purpose was to basically pilot something called the Godkiller Armor. Now, the Godkiller Armor is a really cool concept, because it's basically like anti-celestial tech. But the reason why is because of the fact that, remember, Recorder 451 looked around and basically said, people are going to become jealous of the Earth, they're going to become concerned about the Earth, but because of all the inhabitants, because of the superpowered beings that exist here, the Earth could one day become a beacon of peace in the universe. Now, we know that just by way of like Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, that Avengers World will be formed. Avengers World will happen, but we're given this cool bit of history about the Marvel Universe. Now, something else is going on, and in fact, we'll actually cover this in our story about the Ultimates, when we basically get to a retcon of the universe. Ultimates is basically retelling this entire origin story. When it comes to the whole concept of the Godkiller Armor, back in the early days of the universe's existence, that is to say, this version of the Marvel Universe, which I think is the 7th iteration of the universe, a war broke out between the Celestials and the Aspirants. But the Aspirants and the Celestials were both vying for dominance of the universe. Now, what the motivation of the Aspirants were, again, we don't know. They're a very enigmatic race of people. All we knew is that the Celestials basically procreate by taking control of a planet, impregnating the planet with the energies of a Celestial, and then when that Celestial emerges, the planet's destroyed, and then there's one more Celestial in the cosmos. The idea was that for the Aspirants to basically stop that from happening and to defeat the Celestials. But during the war between the Aspirants and the Celestials themselves, the Aspirants had developed the Godkiller Armor that stands 25,000 feet tall. And this Godkiller Armor served the purpose of basically destroying Celestials. And the war was massive. It was a universe-wide war. Now, what we learned in Ultimates is that this conflict is simply the 7th time it's happened. That back in the beginning of all things, when the very first universe came into existence, that universe was basically called the Firmament. And that universe created Aspirants and it created Celestials. Both of these beings were designed to basically view the first Firmament as being, you know, kind of like an all-encompassing entity. That is to say, they basically worshipped it. The problem is that some of these beings, namely the Celestials, began to operate with autonomy, which is to say they basically broke away from the influence of the first Firmament and became their own beings. And so because of this, the war between the Celestials and the Aspirants was actually a war between those who were loyal to the first Firmament and those who were not. And so because of this, the Celestials basically won. The first Firmament was pushed to the brink of all existence, and the cycle repeated itself each time the universe took form. So each time the universe collapsed and a new one was born, the entire cycle repeated all over again. The exception to this is that the first Firmament existed outside of all space and time and outside of the main universe itself, and just watch the multiverse collapse and be reborn 6 or 7 times, leading up to the formation of the all-new, all-different Marvel Universe following the events of Secret Wars. And so, of course, what we find out is that with Tony Stark being here, with Recorder 451 still maintaining control of his suit of armor, what happened is that when Recorder 451 went to the planet Valdi, led Tony Stark there, and then stole the heart of the Valdi, the reason for that is because of the fact that the heart was needed to power the Godkiller Armor. And the idea here is that Recorder 451 essentially engineered Tony Stark so that he and he alone could pilot the Godkiller Armor, station it on planet Earth, and become essentially a warning to anybody who shows up on Earth that there would be massive ramifications. Because you got to think, anybody who showed up on Earth with the intention of attacking it would be obliterated by the Godkiller Armor just because of the amount of power that it possesses. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Of course, in the middle of all this, we're met by the arrival of Death's Head. And the reason why is because of the fact that with the character of Death's Head, it was Recorder 451 trying to wrap up all loose ends. Death's Head is, for all intents and purposes, the best bounty hunter in the entire Marvel universe. And because of this, with him being as capable as he is, the Recorder basically put a bounty on his head. And so this really kind of shows us the arrogance and the hubris of the Recorder to basically try to eliminate the greatest bounty hunter in the universe by sending other bounty hunters after him. And so again, what this does is, because of the fact that Death's Head is just a giant machine, the Recorder hacks into him and essentially shuts him down. Really just kind of makes him into his own personal slave. And so again, the commands that have been given to these individuals that the Recorder hacks into, namely the suit of Iron Man and Death's Head, is do not allow me to be harmed, do not harm me, and carry out my orders. Now, they're given free will to do anything they want to, but if Tony Stark tried to kill Recorder 451, the suit wouldn't let him. If Death's Head tried to kill Recorder 451, his body wouldn't let him, but he still maintains his own mind, he still maintains his own intelligence and his own thoughts and desires, and even free speech. He just can't kill Recorder 451 and has to follow all of his orders. And so because of this, Tony Stark's required to think fast. Now, because of the fact that the suit itself responds to Tony Stark as much as it responds to Pepper Potts, it's really kind of like a redundant system. If the Pepper AI essentially becomes corrupted, Tony Stark can basically purge it and then operate the suit on his own. And that's exactly what he does. Of course, the Pepper AI pretty much kind of goes with this idea as well, because it's the only way to save what it is that's happening. But Stark essentially shuts down the suit and then just runs, and that's it. So at this point, he's really just kind of stuck on his feet. But the funny thing about this is that when Death's Head had shown up and had basically fought on behalf of Tony Stark, even for only a moment, he made reference to the fact that Tony Stark's own weapon systems had followed him there. Now, the reason why was because with the Pepper AI basically taken over by Recorder 451, the AI was still able to function and use all of its normal resources. And so what it basically did is it realized, if Recorder 451 hacked into me, then I can basically recall all the armors of Tony Stark when it doesn't realize what's going on. And Tony Stark can basically just jury rig the armor so that they can work without having to worry about, Recorder 451 hacking into them. And that's exactly what he does. He basically begins grabbing all these different suits of armor to essentially wire them all together as a dummy system so Recorder 451 can't use them. But the fact remains that with regards to Death's Head, because it's essentially acting to try to destroy Recorder 451, it essentially acts around the parameters that it basically just kind of takes 451 and just dives off the side of, one of the ledges, hoping that it'll destroy Recorder 451 at the same time, because when they hit the bottom of the Godkiller Armor, they'll have been traveling almost 5 miles because of how tall it is. Of course, Recorder 451 says unhand me, and that's that. That's the end of Death's Head. But again, what this does is it shows us the intelligence and the ingenuity of Tony Stark, but it's also this idea that not everything is what it seems. And the reason why is because Kieron Gillen is hinting at the idea that either something went wrong with the plan of Recorder 451 or Tony Stark is not the child of Howard and Maria. And the reason why is because of the fact that the child of Howard and Maria was programmed to be able to access and to pilot the Godkiller Armor. When Recorder 451 sends the Godkiller Armor careening into a planet, hoping that Tony Stark will seize control as pilot, merge with the armor, and then deter it away from the planet itself, Stark tries it and can't control the suit. He cannot control the ship. And so because of this, the indication here from Kieron Gillen is that Tony Stark is not the biological child of Howard and Maria. Now, this is really interesting because when this first dropped, it was the talk of the town. Tony Stark is not the child of Howard and Maria? That's crazy. But the fact remains here that with Tony Stark unable to pilot the suit of armor, ultimately, it ends up destroying the planet. Now, again, this is where the whole views and the whole perspectives begin to shift. And the reason why is because of the fact that from the perspective of Recorder 451, Tony Stark did not stop the Godkiller Armor from crashing into the planet because he chose not to, not because he couldn't. And so again, this is really kind of interesting because it makes Recorder 451 very human in the sense that he's just kind of ignoring facts in place of what he believes to be true, because in truth, he doesn't know what's going on. It also shows us how durable and how strong the Recorders are. I mean, they're nigh unstoppable just in terms of their physical structure, in terms of their durability. Now, there's all different kinds of things that he can do, but ultimately, alongside the assistance of Pepper, the hacking system of Recorder 451 is destroyed, which in turn frees her from his control and really just kind of sets the stage for the Recorder system to be almost completely obliterated. Now, before this happens, Tony Stark actually grabs the Recorder, drags him over to one of the interface devices, and forces the Recorder to bear witness to the fact that Tony Stark can cannot control it. Like, you couldn't tell him the truth, you had to make him see the truth. With the Recorder basically realizing that Tony Stark is not the child of Howard and Maria, the question becomes, then who is? Who is the child of Howard and Maria? Now, at this point for the Recorder, it doesn't matter. I mean, his life is basically done. I mean, it's really just kind of over. And so because of the fact that he says, look, I acted in what I thought was the best interest, only for me to find out that I basically screwed up, my purpose is null, it essentially just kind of deletes itself. And so because of that, Tony Stark really has no way out. I mean, the doors are sealed. Sure, the Godkiller armor is sent away from the planet Earth, but it's also told by the Recorder to begin the process of jumping to another dimension, to jump to another reality, and it'll take Tony Stark with it if Stark's not able to get out. And so again, building on this intelligence of Tony Stark, of course, he ends up grabbing the Recorder and then hooking up his hacking system and breaking himself free. That's really it. It just kind of gets him out as fast as he possibly can, and then they basically just bail out. But something else that I also want you to notice here is the idea of a Dyson sphere. When the Godkiller armor was first introduced as part of this story, it was basically hidden away from all things in existence inside of a Dyson sphere. Of course, the Dyson sphere serving the purpose, or serving multiple purposes, of being able to like absorb solar energy, built around a star, that kind of thing. But it was designed for the purpose of keeping the Godkiller armor hidden. The reason why this matters is because this is yet another instance when Hickman will reach into existing stories from the Iron Man comics and the Captain America comics and so on, and roll them over into incursions and everything. When the Infinity Gauntlet, when the gems shattered and they weren't able to use a gauntlet anymore, Tony Stark decided to build a Dyson sphere around the sun and then channeled the energies of the sun to destroy incursing planets. So again, it was really kind of a cool idea in terms of how it all just kind of reaches together and how it all kind of comes back in. But what we end up having here is Tony Stark arriving back on Earth, only to find out that where he had basically taken off before his birthday, she essentially just kind of held his birthday celebration off until he got back. And then it's the Avengers and everything. But the important thing here is that Tony Stark begins to remember what it was that went on with regards to Recorder 451, the idea that the programmed child of Howard and Maria Stark was made for the purpose of being able to access the Godkiller armor. The fact that Tony Stark wasn't able to do that meant that he was not the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark. Now, the reason why he comes to this conclusion is because of the fact that Recorders are robots. They're not designed to be human. They're not designed to make mistakes. In this instance, with everything that it was that Recorder 451 had done, there was no reason to indicate that it was wrong about the idea that only Howard and Maria's child should be able to access the Godkiller armor. And so after going through all this documentation and going through all this different paperwork, Tony Stark comes to the only logical conclusion that he can, that Howard and Maria Stark do have a child, and that child is not him. And so what we do is we jump back to the initial scenario when Recorder 451 appeared to Howard and Maria Stark and offered the option of allowing them to have a child, but stating that there would be some genetic modifications that would be made to it. And in this discussion between the two of them, they effectively just wrote notes to one another asking the question, can it be trusted? Do you believe that it has our best interests and hearts? And so again, it really showed the idea that from the very beginning, Howard and Maria Stark did not trust Recorder 451. Now, ultimately, they ended up going through with it. The change to the plan came by way of Howard Stark himself. And again, this shows us just how smart he is. And so what we end up finding out here is that when Maria Stark was impregnated with a child, and then Recorder 451 began the process of genetically modifying that child, Howard began to go through with all the notes that he was given by Recorder 451 and began meddling around and investigating in terms of what was happening, and found a hidden line of code that was basically designed for the purpose of killing the child of Howard Maria Stark when it was around 30, when it was in his 30s, maybe close to 40. And so it was basically a suicide gene. Now, we know by virtue of reading the story, the gene was created by Recorder 451 so that it would be able to grab the child of Howard Maria Stark, whisk it off to the Godkiller armor, make it part of the Godkiller armor, presumably infusing its mind with the armor itself, making it a pilot, and then its physical body would just shut down, so there would be nothing left but the mind stuck inside the Godkiller armor. What Howard did is he basically created a serum of sorts that would disrupt this gene. Now, the crazy thing about this is he does not tell his wife. He does not tell Maria Stark about what's going on, but it's not because he doesn't trust her. He does it because of the fact that Recorder 451 kept extremely close tabs on Maria Stark, because of the fact that the future of all the Recorder's plans hinged on this child being born happy and healthy. And so what ends up happening here is that when the baby's born, it shows some struggling, it shows some wheeziness, and it's effectively born with cellular degeneration. And this is when Howard Stark says, I found a weird kind of scenario a weird line of code inside this kid's genes. I tried to find a way to neutralize it, and instead, I basically incapacitated our child. Their mind will stay intact, but they'll never be able to use their physical body. The other half of this is that if Recorder 451 ever found out about this, it would likely kill Howard and Maria Stark and start over again with somebody else, presumably somebody a little more naive that can't quite investigate on the same level that Howard Stark did. And so in order to maintain their position in terms of keeping everything under wraps, what they ended up doing is they took their biological child, Arno Stark, they put him in their own little hospice of sorts, and then in turn, they adopted Tony Stark to keep their cover, to make it look like everything was going along as planned. And so the implication here is that Tony Stark is just as smart as he is because he's just that damn smart, because he's just that intelligent. But putting two and two together, for the first time in his life, he encounters his brother, Arno Stark. And this is so cool because Arno's first, really statement to him is, just so you know, I would have worked it out like a decade ago. And so for the most part, they get on with a pretty good start. Now, of course, a lot of this seems to be because of the fact that Arno is quite aware that Tony Stark was never told about what was going on. So he's coming into this completely blind. Stark never knew about what was happening. And so the result of this is that with these two brothers being extremely intelligent, then the question becomes, if this is what Tony Stark was able to do in isolation, and he does not seem to have the intelligence that his brother has in terms of being so capable, what in the world could they possibly do together? And so what this does is this sets the stage for the next story by Kieron Gillen called Iron Metropolitan. Okay, so getting into the Iron Metropolitan, what I want to do before we start this is I want to run over the 10 rings of the Mandarin. And the reason why is because of the fact that what Kieron Gillen is going to do is basically turn the rings of the Mandarin into the equivalent of lantern rings in Marvel Comics. Now, the reason why I say this is because of the fact that the rings themselves are actually going to start seeking out people in this particular story and going into the rings of the Mandarin. And the lantern rings in DC Comics serve the same purpose. You have the ability to instill great hope, that's the Blue Lantern rings. You have the ability to instill great fear, that's the Sinestro Corps rings. Because of that, it's really one of these scenarios where Marvel's just kind of borrowing from DC, but it's done in a way that still works. Now, with regards to the rings of the Mandarin, there are 10 of them, and each of the rings has its own distinct property or ability that makes it separate from any of the other rings. Now, in truth, I compared all the information from the Marvel Wiki to the comics, so the Marvel Wiki is actually right this time. And so we're just going to kind of go with the list that they have there. But the Remaker is basically a ring that allows the Mandarin to manipulate the atomic and molecular structure of matter, but it cannot transmute elements or affect objects encased in force or energy fields, meaning it cannot turn something into gold. And if something's behind a force field, it can't do anything to access it. The Influence ring allows the Mandarin to generate and project various beams of concussive force. Pretty straightforward. The Spin ring causes the air to move about at high speeds like it were in a vortex, and the vortex can be used as an offensive weapon, as a means of levitating objects, or as a means of propelling the ring's wearer through the air, basically giving them the power of flight. The Spectral ring allows the Mandarin to project a beam of energy capable of destroying the bonds between the atoms and molecules of any particular object, causing inanimate objects to disintegrate. The problem with this is the ring has to recharge for 20 minutes after each use. Of course, this is basically a caveat that allows Marvel to keep the Mandarin from being a guy who can just manipulate matter on the atomic scale anytime he wants to. Now, the Nightbringer ring allows the Mandarin to create an area of darkness, presumably using Dark Force energy to do so. Now, Dark Force energy is almost like Vanta Black in a lot of different ways. For those of you guys who don't know what that is, Vanta Black is a shade of black that's so incredibly dark that anything that's sprayed with the color Vanta Black basically just looks like a hole in reality. It's crazy how dark it is. Like, there's one image circulating out there somewhere of a basketball that was sprayed with Vanta Black, and it looks like it's just a hole in reality. It's crazy how it looks. Like, it's really kind of mind-blowing. But for those of you guys who are reading Secret Empire, Dark Force energy is what was used to basically encase all of New York so that Doctor Strange and everybody was just kind of trapped in another dimension. So again, it's really one of these things where it just harnesses other dimensional power. But the Daemonic ring allows the Mandarin to generate and manipulate various forms of electromagnetic energy. The Incandescence ring allows the Mandarin to project blasts of infrared and produce flame or ignite combustible material. The Lyre, which is actually going to be one of the more interesting rings in this story, magnifies the Mandarin's psionic energies, allowing him to mentally manipulate the thoughts and actions of others, and will actually actually hint on how that was used by the Mandarin himself here in a little bit. The lightning ring allows the Mandarin to project blasts of electrical energy. It literally does exactly what it sounds like. It generates lightning. The zero ring allows the Mandarin to project waves of intense cold and ice, including trapping foes in ice blocks and sheaths. So it basically just kind of allows the Mandarin to manipulate cold weather. That's really it. It kind of like gives them the power of Iceman in a lot of different ways. Now, having run over that list real quick, the whole basis behind the idea of really Iron Metropolitan is to show us what the potential could possibly be with the Arno and Stark brothers. Remember, of course, in the last video, we talked about how Tony Stark had learned about his brother Arno, basically the genetically engineered brother that's the biological child of Howard and Maria Stark, and that Tony himself was basically just adopted. And so again, this was really kind of cool because it served two purposes. The first was creating a more compelling story, and the second was actually bringing to us the idea that Tony Stark is as smart as he is because he's just that smart. It's just genuine natural intelligence. So again, it's kind of a cool scenario. But with regards to the future that really beholds the Earth for these two guys, remember, Tony Stark was basically told by Recorder 451 prior to its death, more or less, that the Earth was a potential beacon for peace across the universe. And we know just by virtue of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, that time will eventually come, something like 10,000 years in the future, or 5,000 years. I don't remember what it is, but there's actually a place called Avengers World. But with regards to getting to that place, what we end up having is really like this glimpse 30 years into the future where Tony Stark and Arno have basically generated peace across the planet Earth. They have this massive city called Troy, and this city basically creates pure energy for the world to use. It really creates a kind of utopia. The downside to this is that they currently have an AI called Helen, and Helen is modeled largely after Recorder 451, but as Tony Stark puts it, was designed to basically stay away from all the glitches and the mistakes that will come along with artificial intelligence. Of course, this turns out not to be the case. Helen goes awry and begins the process of tearing up everything that Tony Stark and Arno Stark have built. Now, of course, in response to this, they end up sending out, some 20,000 Iron Man suits that are piloted by AIs, modeled after Pepper Potts, after James Rhodes, but in the end, it doesn't make any difference. Everything they've worked for has been destroyed. And so what we end up learning is that this is actually a simulation that both Arno Stark and Tony Stark are experiencing, and in every single instance of this simulation, the AI Helen that they create ultimately goes awry. Now, the reason why this is important is because Tony and Arno take two different stances on this. Arno's response is, you cannot toy with AI. Every single simulation we've run, the AI will always become sentient and it'll always run amok. In Tony Stark's mind, there's going to be a way around it. There's got to be a way to basically set up that AI so it will not go down that path. It will not become a villain, more or less. And so again, it's really kind of wild because we learned that Tony Stark had basically brought, Recorder 451 back to Earth for the purpose of really doing nothing more than just kind of experimenting on and learning about the technology that it has. Because remember, with that recorder having been around for millions of years, it assimilated all different kinds of technology from across the universe, technology that humanity hasn't even experienced yet. The only way to access it is in Recorder 451. So again, Tony Stark basically has preview to technology and advances that humanity would otherwise never have access to. But at the end of the day, his mind is still that they can create this utopia for the world, and they can literally transform Earth into a beacon of peace across the universe. But the first step is finding a way to salvage and to access all the technology within, Recorder 451 and basically save Earth itself. And so from here, this is when we begin the process of switching over to the idea of essentially Marvel's version of the Green Lantern rings, in the sense that one of the Mandarin rings arrives to a woman by the name of Abigail Beryl Burns, who really goes by the name Red Peril, essentially, as she puts it. She's really more of like a journalist, but she goes through and writes about corporations that engage in seedy actions and different things like that. But she's really just kind of pissed off at the world, and she hates capitalism and different things like that. And so the result is that she's given a ring and she's deemed to be Mandarin 7. And the idea is to essentially take revenge against Tony Stark. Now, we don't really know why. We don't know why these rings are taking revenge against Tony Stark. And in fact, the rings have never become sentient before. The rings are only ever objects that were used by the Mandarin to basically fight against Tony Stark. So this is wholly new. This is brand new stuff by Kieron Gillen. And it's actually really kind of cool to see it all unfold. But what we also end up finding out here is the first stage to Tony Stark's plan of basically revamping the world is traveling to Mandarin City. Now, this is kind of interesting because when Matt Fraction first introduced Mandarin City, there wasn't really a whole lot to go on there. It was just there. one day. The Mandarin just kind of had a base of operations in Mandarin City. The only indication we were given was that it was someplace off the coast of China, that the Mandarin presumably used some kind of seedy, means, used, his liar ring, for example, the ability to manipulate the minds of others to basically give himself that island or to take it from China. And that was really it. But during the whole long way down storyline, when the Mandarin basically kidnapped both Ezekiel Stane, the son of Obadiah Stane, and Tony Stark, and forced them to begin building these giant, mechanized suits that would allow the Mandarin essentially to engage in world domination, they effectively turned against him. But where Tony Stark was working to defeat the Mandarin using technology and taking down these various powered suits and so on and so forth, Ezekiel Stane actually fought the Mandarin and killed him. And so what it did is it basically left Mandarin City with a giant power vacuum. And so what started happening is that all these different warlords and these petty criminals who were living under the Mandarin began to vie for power. And so you had triads, who were showing up, these Asian-based gangs and so on and so forth. And really, Mandarin City just kind of turned into a giant war zone. Now, Tony Stark going in here alongside Arno Stark, who's basically piloting some of the Stark armors, is designed for the purpose of basically clearing the city out, seizing control of Mandarin City, and then basically turning it into like this refuge, turning it into this safe haven. And so what we end up doing is we travel to basically the core, which is, within Mandarin City more or less. And what we have Tony Stark doing is taking the Pepper AI, removing her from him, putting her inside the core of the system, and renaming her Helen. And so because of this, it's really kind of Tony Stark falling down the path of becoming the guy that's eventually going to lead to this Helen robot losing its mind and destroying everything. So again, it's almost one of these scenarios where it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. From here, we kind of skip forward, a little bit, or at least we kind of pick up in the modern day where Stark had previously, kind of cleared out Mandarin City. But the fact remains, with all the construction and everything that's taking place here, once Mandarin City is basically cleaned out and once it's renamed to Troy, we end up, of course, having Tony Stark making a declaration to all those who are present, making a declaration to the press that Troy is going to serve as a beacon. It's going to serve as a place where those people who are living in destitution, those people who are living in squalor, they can leave their struggling areas and they can come to a place that's new. Now, this is really kind of cool because it's really one of those scenarios where Marvel, or really Kieron Gillen's, building on what's already been established. And that's really kind of the way it goes. In Marvel Comics, there was really a place called Asteroid M, or Avalon, depending on what you choose to call it, that was created by Magneto. And it was designed to be a safe haven for mutants away from the oppressive regime of humanity. Now, of course, this basically put humanity in a state of fear. When you end up having, almost all forces basically withdrawing from an area, that means something really bad is going to happen. And so because of that, humanity, looking at it from a wartime perspective, believed that, Magneto was pulling all the mutants off of Earth because he was in turn going to cleanse the Earth in its entirety, just eradicate everybody on Earth. So of course, humanity struck against Magneto. Magneto struck back, issued a blanket EMP around the planet. The X-Men intervened, and that led into fatal attractions when Wolverine lost his adamantium. So again, it was really kind of a cool scenario in terms of how it all kind of unfolded and what led to what and different things like that. But this is still very much the same thing. Tony Stark going into an existing territory that's basically in a state of flux, co-opting it, and then making it his own. The issue with this is that while all this goes down, we end up finding out another ring had basically bonded to somebody else, this person going by the name of Mandarin 1. Now, of course, we don't know who this person is, but Tony Stark immediately recognizes the signatures of the ring. Now, of course, Abigail takes this opportunity to effectively attack Tony Stark. So it's really more of an alliance without an intention to be an alliance. And so she's just kind of jumping into the moment and using the distraction as a way to basically take on Stark. Now, of course, donning his Iron Man suit, we end up finding out how far Stark has come, because remember, all of this comes out of Extremis. And so while Tony Stark had long since abandoned the Extremis technology, the fact remains here that what he ends up doing is basically creating a stealth suit for himself that he's been wearing the entire time. It's just you didn't know it was there because it's a stealth suit. So it's actually kind of cool. But from here, things are pretty straightforward. I mean, in the sense that he's able to run off, Abigail for a time and basically kind of retreats. And that's really about it. And so the question that Tony Stark has is, if that was a ring of the Mandarin, then what happened to the rings of the Mandarin? Now, the reason why we ask that question is because of the fact that the rings are extremely dangerous, and they're not like lantern rings, right? Like if you were someone who just walked up and picked up a Green Lantern ring, if it doesn't deem you as being a person that's worthy to wield it, you wouldn't be able to use it. The rings of the Mandarin don't work that that way. Anybody can put it on, and suddenly they've got all the powers that come along with it. And so what Tony Stark does is, alongside James Rhodes, investigate the SHIELD weapons vault Omega. Now, this is a multifaceted vault, and the reason why is because of the fact that if you've ever wondered what happens to like the weapons of massive villains who launch an attack and they're defeated and so on and so forth, they're all basically stationed in different vaults, and there's a lot of places like that around the Marvel Universe. But because the rings of the Mandarin do not require any measure of worth in order to be able to use them, or at least previously they didn't, once Tony Stark and James Rhodes begin to go there and they basically start looking around, they see all the rings that are there. But having an AI scan it means that the AI will see what's truly there and will not see what their eyes see. And this is when we learn that the liar ring had basically been duping everybody, that once a week a member of SHIELD will go down there, they will investigate, they'll check and make sure all the rings are there, and if they are, they'll seal everything back up and they'll leave. The liar ring had basically been making it appear as though all the rings were there to the human eye, messing with people's psychological mindsets. But an AI does not have a psychological mind, it's literally just tech. And so because of that, Tony Stark and James Rhodes are basically informed all the other rings of the Mandarin are just out there. Of course, the liar ring being the last one to take off and do its own thing. Now again, this is kind of wild because the rings are essentially becoming sentient. That's never happened before. Again, we're in uncharted territory here. And so what we end up finding out here is that where Abigail, or Red Peril, of course, has been chosen to wield one of the rings of the Mandarin, her allegiance is not so cut and dry. And that's what makes things kind of cool, is because usually in Marvel Comics, when a villain or when a person is given absolute power and they have an agenda, they usually become a bad guy. Abigail is not that way. She got a ring of the Mandarin and she has this ring's abilities, but she's a journalist first, and whatever she is now, second, a villain or an anti-hero, whatever you want to call her. And so her idea is to investigate the city. What's really going on? Does Tony Stark have an ulterior motive, or is he actually doing the right thing? And what we end up finding out is that the way this city is designed to function, it's designed to basically create perpetual energy. It's designed to be a city where people won't have to pay utility bills, where it'll basically feed people by generating food. They won't have to go and buy groceries. It'll be 100% self-contained, renewable system. And that's something no one's ever seen before. This is a tried and true utopia. And once Abigail begins to realize this, this is when she comes to the conclusion that the city is quite literally designed to make everything better for anybody who's in it. So Tony Stark is actually benefiting humanity instead of profiteering off humanity. And so what this does is it really changes the perspective that Abigail has of Tony Stark. She still looks at him as just kind of like a weapons manufacturer and a profiteer, but in this instance, he's trying to do the right thing. And so tearing the city down would actually hurt people as opposed to help them. And so what we end up having is basically her being led to the other individuals out there who have the rings of the Mandarin. For example, a guy who has the Remaker ring calls himself Lord Remaker. And so again, because of this, this leads to really just kind of like a massive conflict between, these other members of the Mandarin Corps, and I guess we could really kind of call it the Mandarin Corps, but these other members of the Mandarin Corps, Iron Man, with Abigail fighting alongside Iron Man. And this is really kind of cool because again, she's very much an anti-hero here in the sense that she's really kind of working against Tony Stark as much as she's working for him, in the sense that she's on his side, but only for the short term. But in this massive conflict, the building that houses Arno Stark effectively comes crashing down. So this is kind of crazy because the implication here was that this would be the death of Arno Stark. And it would be kind of a pretty lackluster scenario if that were the case, just because of the fact that Arno has proven himself to be one of the most intelligent members of the Stark family. I mean, really, he's in a lot of ways, I would surmise, smarter than Tony Stark. And so because of this, nothing that Stark has done here with regards to Mandarin City, the city of Troy, none of this would be possible without Arno. Stark couldn't pull it off. Of course, we end up finding out that Arno actually survived the blast. And what he'd been doing is he had been working on his own version of an Iron Man suit. But it's not really a traditional Iron Man suit as we think of it. Instead, it's basically just a massive tank. Now, of course, this is kind of funny because it's half wish fulfillment and half practicality. One thing you got to think of is that Arno Stark spent his entire life confined to a bed in an iron lung. And so all the intelligence and everything he had more or less went to waste because he could never use any of it. But it didn't keep him from imagining what kind of life he could have. In this scenario, with the work that they've done, with the work that Arno Stark and the work that Tony Stark have done together, being attacked by this Mandarin Corps, we essentially have Arno building his own Iron Man suit, this massive battle tank, and just kind of like riding high into the conflict. And it's actually really cool to see because, again, it's practical. It's not designed to be this super maneuverable suit because there's already a ton of those. It's designed to be a suit that can basically control the different models that are out there. The reason being because, of course, you know, the Helen AI has more or less been taken down at this point. And so because of that, the Iron Man suits are just kind of flying around on autopilot. Some of them are being shot down, some of them are shooting at the wrong targets, but having a suit ran by Arno that can consolidate the AI of all these other suits into a singular source means that he can control all the other suits. And so what we end up having here is one of the members of the Mandarin Corps basically just kind of vanishes out of nowhere. And no one really knows where he went to. Of course, Abigail begins to poke around and finds out that the guy has been decapitated. Not only that, her hands are basically cut off by some unknown source and her ring is taken from her. And so again, what it seems like is someone around there, somebody somewhere, is consolidating all these Mandarin rings unto themselves, which begs the question, are they the ones that activated the Mandarin rings in the first place and made them sentient? Initially, we're not given this explanation. Instead, all we end up having is Abigail without hands. Of course, her hands are basically cut off, but she continues to kind of scream at Tony Stark about her, you know, agenda and so on and so forth. And that's really about it. But at the end of the day, because of the fact that Troy is just kind of collapsed the way that it does, because of the fact that Abigail made the case that, look, you're building a city here, that's great for everyone that lives here, but the target's always you. Everybody's always coming after you. So long as you're here, you're making Troy a target. Because of that, Tony Stark basically kind of gets up on a podium and says, look, you know, I tried running a city, it was really too much of a hassle, so I quit, and then just leaves. And that's really it. Instead, he leaves the running of the city to his brother Arno Stark. And so with that in mind, what we end up finding out here is that where the hands of Abigail were cut off, one of the members of the Mandarin Corps was decapitated, the person who had done this was actually Malekith the Accursed. Of course, as we know, one of the Dark Elves from Svartalheim. And so what this does is it basically brings the Asgardians into the mix. And it really kind of asks the question, what would happen if a being who's already godlike in terms of their durability and strength were to gain virtually godlike powers because of the rings of the Mandarin? Okay, so we are at the final story of Iron Man before we get into Superior Iron Man. But it's kind of funny here because a lot of people who talk about Arno Stark, the brother of Iron Man, this is the story where it just ends and we never find out what happens with him. It's one of the biggest irritations that Iron Man fans have. A lot of this is because of the fact that Superior Iron Man was just like a holdover story until All New, All Different Marvel kicked off when we had Avengers, New Avengers, Secret Wars, all that kind of stuff. But the idea with this is that in the last video, we had basically dealt with the Rings of the Mandarin. Now, for the most part, where this continues that story, the Rings of the Mandarin had always been this interesting scenario. I mean, I would go as far as to say that in a lot of ways, the Rings of the Mandarin were based off the Green Lantern mythos. That is to say, Hal Jordan having a Green Lantern ring, the Green Lantern ring can make constructs. The reason why I say it's largely based off that is because in Marvel, really in DC, if I'm going to be honest, for the most part, when people think of like superheroes that wear rings, they associate that with the Green Lantern Hal Jordan, with the Green Lantern mythos. The general idea here is that the Rings of the Mandarin made their debut actually all the way back in 1961, I think it was, in Strange Tales number 89. And that actually dealt just with the idea of the McLuhans, I think is how you pronounce their name, I can't remember. But the idea is that the Rings of the Mandarin serve different purposes. Each ring can function accordingly. And what this story actually does is it fleshes out the nature of the fact that the rings have some measure of sentience. Initially, we open up with Malekith the Accursed. Now, what we don't know is how this ring managed to get to the realm of the Dark Elves. But the fact that the ring captured by Malekith is a pretty big deal. Now, remember, these are not like the Green Lantern rings strictly in DC Comics, right? Like in DC, a Green Lantern ring will pop up to you and it'll say, you, whoever's watching this video, you have been selected for the Green Lantern Corps, something along those lines. But then if it turns around and decides you're not worthy, it'll just leave you and go find somebody else. With this, it's not the same way. The rings seek people out, but people can just capture them. They can just take them and use the rings for their own purposes. Now, keep in mind, something to take note of here, and what we had talked about in the last video with the character of Abigail Burns and a lot of these other members who had been chosen for these various rings of the Mandarin, they had basically received their rings, and the rings were acting in accordance of people who had a grudge with Tony Stark, whatever that grudge may be. Maybe they just didn't like him as a person. In this instance, it's actually they had a Broadway play and they fired the director because he was one of those weird hipster art guys, and the result was they were like, hey, look, nobody wants your interpretation, they just want a cool show. And so they ended up canning the guy. The result was that he was just pissed, and he was given one of the rings of the Mandarin, picked it up and just started using it against Iron Man. So again, it's not really a very strict process. The overall gist with this is that with Malekith basically taking one of the Mandarin rings, rings, the goal is to use all the rings for himself. Now, what this does is this picks back up with Arno Stark. Now remember, at this point, Arno Stark is very much a background character. If you're new to the whole thing of Iron Man so far in our different videos, Arno Stark was basically revealed to have been the brother of Tony Stark that we never knew about. Basically, Arno is biologically engineered. He exists for the purpose of basically being super smart. He was basically kept away. This combined with the fact that he was basically given a short lifespan meant that he was confined to a bed. He really couldn't move or anything. This was because of the fact that Howard Stark had messed around with the genes and added a few modifications, and the result was that Arno did not come out the way that he was supposed to. But the general gist of this and the general idea is that this focuses largely on the efforts of Tony Stark to basically travel to Svartalheim, travel to the realm of the Dark Elves, basically capture Malekith and take the Mandarin rings back, because that's what Malekith has been doing. At this moment, there are 4 Mandarin rings that are out there that we know about. And what we know is that Malekith has been running around Earth, killing those individuals who have those Mandarin rings and then taking them. Now, of course, this also ends up bringing in a girl by the name of Siobhan. And Siobhan is like a weird situation when it comes to Marvel. It's like her dad sold her soul to the devil, then her dad turned out to be evil. It's this weird thing, but it goes all the way back to like 1992. And I cannot remember the name of her story for the life of me, but she is very obscure in a lot of different ways. But she's one of these characters that exists out there in Marvel Comics where she's really knowledgeable about being able to blend technology with magic. And the reason this matters is because of the fact that for Tony Stark, while he could basically go tell Thor, say, hey, look, man, Malekith of the Dark Elves is basically running around and grabbing these Mandarin rings and he's going to become super powerful and then probably invade Asgard, Tony Stark and Thor are not on the best of terms. Remember, this all comes after the events of Siege. And so for the most part, Asgard was destroyed in Siege. Now, Tony Stark helped to rebuild it, but the idea is that Thor, for the most part, still really just doesn't like Iron Man following the events of Civil War, where Thor learned that Iron Man had basically cloned Thor and created this cybernetic or the cyborg version of him. So again, they're kind of on weird terms. Now, in truth, for Tony Stark's worth, in this scenario, the argument that he makes is that this could very well lead to a massive Asgardian thing, because there's the Council of Realms and all that kind of good stuff. And if he shows up on Thor's doorstep and says, hey, look, Malekith is capturing Mandarin rings, well, then it turns into this big political thing. It turns into this Council of Realms coming together, and then it's like, okay, you who represent the Dark Elves, what do you have to say about this? And then it's, well, we don't really know what you're talking about. We haven't really done anything. Then it's debating, and then it's deciding if they're going to do anything. It's all that bureaucracy, all that talk. Why deal with that? Why not just go directly to the heart of the problem? The issue with this is that this mission was supposed to be a stealth mission. And so because of this, when Tony Stark lands in the realm of the Dark Elves, he lands in the middle of everything. He literally lands in the throne room of Malekith. And this is a terrible situation for him, because under normal circumstances, if he was preparing to do this, if it was his intention to directly go against Malekith, he would have worn armor that would have allowed him to do that. But in this instance, this is Black Ops armor. This is armor that allows him to basically camouflage. This is armor that doesn't make sounds. And so because of this, showing up in the middle of a throne room with armor that's designed for secrecy as opposed to combat does him almost no good. Now keep in mind, one of the discussions that we had, or one of the common threads that went through our discussions when we ran over all the different armors of Iron Man, is that all the armors are built for combat on some level, just because of the fact that Tony Stark never knows if he's going to be on a recon mission and he's going to have to, engage in some measure of combat. But there are armors that are better suited for combat than others. And so again, that's the basis behind this. This armor is not best suited for combat. At the same time, teleporting Tony Stark to Svartalheim is huge, because there's really only 3 opportunities. The power cell, the power basis used to do this is massive. And so it can only be done 3 times, meaning that if he sends something to, back to Earth, or if something is sent to him and it uses 3 charges, there's no way for him to get back. And so the result of this is that he really has no choice but to fight Malekith, or at least, fend off as best he can and then eventually bail out. Now, of course, the reason for this is because of the fact that Siobhan had basically been working on a weapon of sorts, on some kind of technology that would allow him to basically stun these rings, to temporarily incapacitate the person that's wielding them and then take the rings away. But something else to point out here, and this is where we get into the whole sentience of it, the rings basically speak with one another. Now, historically speaking, I do not believe this was an element of Mandarin originally. But with the rings communicating with one another, what we're basically getting here is this idea that the rings all basically harbor a grudge for Tony Stark. Now, why they hate him, again, we'll get into that as we get through this. But one thing that ends up happening is that the various forces of Malekith really kind of descend directly on Tony Stark. And so, of course, again, kind of fleeing, running for his life, doing the best that he can, facing off against these forces here and there, using guerrilla guerrilla warfare tactics, he's able to hold his own to a degree. But in the end, he ends up calling on Siobhan to basically teleport an item for the third time directly to him. So of course, this basically uses up all the charges and does not give him the ability to necessarily teleport out. And so what ends up happening here is we basically have Iron Man donning this armor. Now, of course, I don't know if this armor was directly specified in terms of the version that exists, but it's basically anti-Asgardian armor. That's really what it's designed for. This is armor that's designed to face off against all forms of magic and sorcery, especially anybody who hails from any of the other 9 realms. And the reason why this matters is because given the nature of this armor, it's directly dangerous to the Dark Elves themselves. Now, the reason why I say that is not necessarily because of like the repulsor blasts of the suit or anything along those lines, but because Dark Elves have an inherent weakness to iron. And so because of the fact that they're weak to iron, this combined with the suit basically being designed for combat means that Iron Man is easily able to overpower and incapacitate every last one of them just by dispersing these iron particles out into the air, covering them in iron dust and different things like that. So again, this is really cool because it really kind of hits home into the idea of where Iron Man stands. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to the character of Iron Man, and this is something that people tend to forget, is the general public, the average person. When the Iron Man movie was announced, one of the biggest issues that Marvel had when they made the film was convincing people that Iron Man was not a robot, that it was actually a person. A lot of folks didn't really know about him. He was a pretty obscure character in terms of the general public, the non-comic reader. And so when you start talking about where Iron Man stands in relation to various superheroes, most people say he's a guy in a suit of armor, and at best he could go against Captain America, maybe Thor, depending on the circumstances. What this tells us is that with his ingenuity, his intelligence, Tony Stark can stand toe-to-toe against some pretty big guys. He's not like Galactus level, right? Like, you're never going to read a story where Tony Stark is like, yes, I have an armor that can withstand Galactus. And if there is a story out there, that story's getting covered. But as far as I'm aware, that story doesn't exist. The general sense here is that just kind of using the weakness of the Dark Elves to iron to his own advantage, he's able to systematically begin taking each and every one of them out, which ultimately leads to him basically capturing Malekith and then stripping the ring away from Malekith. Now, of course, this leads to Malekith basically teleporting away. The idea that one of his servants just kind of shows up with another ring that she had essentially captured for herself. Malekith ends up grabbing this ring with the intention of using it, but this is the disintegration ring. This is the spectral ring. Now, this is actually one of those rings that has an interesting caveat. For the most part, the rings can be used kind of endlessly. When it comes to the spectral ring, because of the fact that it's designed to basically break down matter on the molecular level, if Marvel were to turn around and say this ring can be used at any time, then you would literally have a person just running around dissolving everything in existence. And so what they did is they created a caveat to say the ring can be used, but it has to be charged, or it has to charge itself for 20 minutes after each use. What ends up happening is that this ring had already been used by the servant of Malekith when she tried to attack Tony Stark. And so the result is that when the ring initially pops up, or when Malekith puts it on, he's got 20 minutes left until he can use it again. This also coincides with what appears to be the arrival of the Asgardians. Now, of course, this is not actually the Asgardians. Instead, these are basically the 6 other ring bearers of the Mandarin rings, the 6 rings that we haven't seen yet. But one of these rings is the liar ring. This is the ring that serves the purpose of tricking the eyes of individuals who the ring is used on. In this instance, it's used on Malekith, tricking him into believing all the Asgardians are there. Now, of course, with these various members who have all popped up, again, a lot of these guys are enemies of Iron Man himself, but a lot of them are just general bad guys. But when it comes to the arrival of these other Mandarin rings, this is basically what's been happening, where the rings have been communing with one another, quote unquote, where they've basically been talking to each other. Their ultimate goal is to defeat Tony Stark. But with the other 4 rings having been captured by Malekith and being used by Malekith for his own ends, it basically disrupts the plans of the other 6 rings. And so the goal was to essentially attach themselves to 6 other individuals who in turn would carry out the wishes of the ring, capture the other 4 from Malekith, and then allow the rings to function in unison and then achieve whatever goal it was they wanted to achieve in taking down Iron Man. And so the result here is that this basically boils down to a circumstance where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. With Iron Man having these rings, he can't necessarily put them on his fingers because in truth, I mean, he can't really use them through the suit. And so the result is that he kind of has to rely on Malekith in order to basically help him out. Now, this is when we start invoking the things of like magical promises and so on and so forth. In Marvel Comics, one of the most notable villains that basically uses trickery and deception when it comes to magical promises is Mephisto. And what Mephisto will do is he'll pop up and he'll say, okay, I'm going to grant your greatest wish. And you'll say, okay, I wish I had $1 million. And Mephisto will say, okay, he'll give you $1 million, but you won't live long enough to use any of it. That's the whole caveat that comes with his this character. With Malekith, it's much the same way. He'll grant your wish, but there's going to be a trick. There's going to be some kind of deception to it. And so, of course, with this in mind, and with Siobhan operating on Earth, basically helping out Tony Stark throughout this whole escapade, what she does is use her knowledge of magic and technology to essentially create this sort of binding contract, which is to say, when Malekith says, I agree to help you out, to help you get out of this alive, that there's no trickery to it. There's no backdoor deal. There's no fine print. And so Malekith is basically bound to this. He couldn't violate it even if he wanted to. And so because of that, he essentially whisks Tony Stark away, you know, when he gives Tony Stark the ring, and they essentially teleport out. And so the landscape is now left open for these other 6 Mandarins to begin achieving their own goals. Now, of course, what it does is it basically brings all the rings back together again. And so with these rings basically being brought back, the idea is that now Tony Stark and Arno working together look to basically recapture these rings and then use them for their own ends. And that's what ends up happening here, is that with these other Mandarins that are out there, their goal is again to basically take down Tony Stark. And so because of this, working together, Tony Stark and Arno effectively invade their base of operations. Now, this is done in several different ways. You have Arno and you have Tony, who are piloting their own suits. Of course, Arno's suit is specifically designed to cater to the fact that Arno doesn't have the ability to walk or really move around at all. But then you also have things like the Trojan Army, for example, this massive army of Iron Man suits that were specially designed for the city of Troy, that city that we talked about in the last few stories. Of course, you also end up having, you know, Abigail Burns, who basically shows up. Again, it's one of these really cool moments because you sort of see this giant kingdom of these Mandarins just come crashing down around them. And so ultimately what we end up finding out is that the person who was in possession of the Liar Ring is actually a guy named Mark. Now, Mark was a character who was introduced in Invincible Iron Man Annual #1, I think it was, in 2010, and that came from Matt Fraction. And the whole idea with Mark was that he was initially introduced as a guy who was essentially going to be like a stand-in for Happy Hogan to a degree. One thing to keep in mind is that Happy Hogan died in Marvel Comics. Like, he's been dead for a while, I'm pretty sure. The goal was to basically begin the process of moving Pepper Potts, give her an actual future. And so in that story, Mark had basically proposed to her after the two of them had spent time together, and of course she accepted. The issue with this was that Mark's perspective of Tony Stark was that Tony Stark was a guy who was really just kind of a dick. And so because of the fact that this built up the idea that Tony Stark was so crass, that Tony Stark was so cruel to Pepper, what ended up happening is the Liar Ring chose him to be able to wield it. And so that's the guy who's been running around using this ring the entire time. This leads to Tony Stark defeating Mark, and that's really all it is. But what this does is it basically begins the process of answering the question of why it is these rings hated Tony Stark so much. And this gets into the nature of the Regellians. The Regellians basically started sending out all these recorders. Of course, we talked about this during the Secret Origin of Tony Stark, but they started sending out all these different, you know, recorders for the purpose of mapping the universe and observing everything and then bringing that information back. In this instance, because of the fact that the rings are basically technological, the explanation essentially goes like this. Back when the rings were originally created and the Mandarin just kind of stumbled into them accidentally, discovered the rings, and then started using them for his own ends, the rings basically began to receive an imprint of the Mandarin. He basically kind of began to instill his personality onto the rings himself. And it was the idea that the rings began to absorb the idea that Tony Stark was just a bad guy. They just wanted to take him out. This combined with the actions of the recorder 451 from the Secret Origin of Tony Stark, this same recorder had basically sort of leaked its personality into the rings themselves as well. And so the result is that the rings basically just kind of became sentient, and then the goal was to just take out Iron Man. That's where all that comes from. And so the result is that once everything begins to sort of get figured out, it all really just kind of begins to wind down, and that's really about it. Of course, the rings are basically left in the possession of Tony Stark himself for him and Arno to do what it is that they want to do with it, to basically use them for their own purposes. The problem with this is that, again, this is the last time we see Arno. We have not seen him since. It's basically just Iron Man and Arno going off to do great things, and we never find out what happened to Arno. We never see or hear from him again. And that's the biggest issue, is because when All New, All Different Marvel picked up and Invincible Iron Man started, we never found out what happened to Arno. We don't know if he's back in his hospital bed. We don't know if he's still hanging out. He's never been seen or heard from. He's literally a non-entity and All New, All Different Marvel. Now, of course, Brian Michael Bendis has said that he's going to go back and revisit the whole issue with Arno, the whole concept of where his character is and what he's been doing, which is cool, and I'm really excited about that. But, you know, for right now, this just jumps directly into Marvel's Axis event and then goes into Superior Iron Man. So with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.